Thank you, Mindy. Next up, I want to welcome Atif Akin. Atif Akin is an artist and designer who lives here in New York. His work examines science, nature, mobility, and politics through an ahistorical and contemporary lens. Atif, welcome.
Today is such an honor. I'm used to doing artist talks, research presentations, recruitment trips, but maybe for the first time, actually, I'm invited to a conference on pedagogy of design. And more importantly, I'm invited by Juliet and Rune. I've been teaching quite a while, like 15 years, in various places at different capacities. 7.5 years ago, I moved to New York, and since then, so whenever there was something to discuss about teaching, I always went to Rune and Juliet. So actually some of these ideas that I'm going to bring up may well be there. So I'm not sure, like sometimes it's mixed up like over the last 7 years. So, but actually until last night, talking about network cultures and resonance, until last night I was thinking of strictly staying in the pedagogical realm. But on Twitter, I saw what Mindy is going to present. And then I decided to also bring one of my works, which I completed in 2016. So my work examines science and mobility and as they relate to contemporary phenomena, including migration, radiation, surveillance, hyperpresence, and genetic mutations. So I work in various media, including design, animation, video, visualization of quantitative information, programmable data, and I explore issues that are considered sensitive in the public discourse, unlocking them from the rigid political categories in which they reside. So we will go back to the student works, but talking about alternative publishing, I wanted to bring a project that I have completed in 2016. It's a series of zines. 16 issues, trilingually published in English, Turkish, and Arabic. I moved to New York like 8 years ago from Istanbul, and I left behind very vibrant design community full of talented, smart designers, artists, filmmakers, but also a terrible academic infrastructure and politics. And back in the day, I guess this was like in 2009, so this is a very common business in Istanbul. It's like a push cart, like a hot dog push cart, but you can have your ID laminated with PVC, and they also have a combo device, which is a scanner, printer, and fax machine, and it's car operated, and it's usually they also sell like small knickknacks, and so they are usually the people who push these carts are usually an immigrant community from Malatya. It's an Armenian city in Turkey. And so, and at the time we had the idea of making a zine just about anything. It could be about music, it could be about pressing political issues, it could be about next party, it could be about anything. And we named the zine as Kayısı Kent, which means apricot city, because this particular city where these pushcarts people are coming from are famous with the apricots. Because apricot actually is an Armenian invention, and that knowledge came from Armenia to Turkey through this Armenian immigrants. That's why a plum is called, in Latin, Prunus armeniaca. It's called the Armenian plum. So then after I moved here, this zine was discontinued, and it was not a very important project. It's been going on for a while. We did it between friends. And so we would put these zines on these pushcarts, and these people would sell our zine for a couple of liras to make extra money, just photocopy on demand. So it was a way of going public on the streets. So it's a way, it's like a publish on demand, but mobile on the street. So that's how we thought like we could reach out to a larger community than our Facebook friends. And so then I moved here, and a couple of years after, the war in Syria and 3 million Syrian refugees moved to Istanbul. And so I've always kept in mind this idea of the zine and the apricot city and this pushcart. And then I went back into the archives and I looked at the story of the apricot. And in Turkish we have a saying, Şam'da kayısı, which means apricot from Damascus. That means it doesn't get any better than that. If something is really good, it implies high quality. And it turns out that I looked into the colonial archives. It's always been the case. The apricots have always came from Damascus, the best ones. And they moved through Turkey to Constantinople at the time, I mean today Istanbul, and then shipped from Istanbul to Alexandria or Greece. So this is actually the same path that the refugees are taking today. They come from Syria, pass through Turkey, either move to Egypt or they're trying to make it to the European Union. And at the same time, I was reading Reflections on Exile from Edward Said. And he also talks about this very puzzling situation in the Middle East, including the Armenian exile. And around the same time, I was also reading the same book that Mindy mentioned, Post-Digital Print. And actually one of the, I don't remember which chapter, where he's talking about Andre Breton's famous saying. So the very urgent question for any designer or for any academic is, why do we publish? And I think this answer was quite satisfying back in 1920 by Andre Breton. One publishes to find comrades. And so I found some comrades. Then we decided to apply for a couple of grants that we can hire translators to translate zines from English to Turkish and Turkish to Arabic and so whatever the source languages, we wanted to make them like trilingual. And then we reached out to a number of Syrian refugees who are trying to make it in Istanbul as writers or artists or musicians. And then we designed this series of zines, 16 of them, and we started distributing them in the city. So because the problem with creating a cultural connection at that moment is the language. A lot of people in Turkey, they don't speak Arabic, and a lot of people coming from Syria, they don't speak Turkish. And the other thing is they're not Facebook friends. So how do we reach out to each other? So we decided that we can reach out to each other through these pushcarts, and then this zine can be on the street. And then so the project at some point was supported by one of the museums in Istanbul, Salt Gallery. And so we did an exhibition, and then this exhibition had some funding that we could also have some billboards and outdoor material that we can reach out to this community, because apparently we wouldn't be able to reach out to this community in digital way. So this was sort of a reverse engineering strategy that we had. And in one of them, I also wanted to join the project as a designer. And I wanted to draw this path that I'm talking about. But of course, I couldn't make this trip from Damascus to Istanbul and Istanbul to Europe and Europe to the West. So, but I realized actually the Metropolitan Museum has the same setting. So if you look at the Metropolitan Museum map, so it follows the same colonial trade routes. So there is the Damascus room. So now we're looking at the Damascus room, which was donated to the Metropolitan Museum by Hagop Gevorkian, an Armenian philanthropist and archaeologist. And next to the Damascus room, you will see the Turkish wing. Let's call it like the Koç galleries. They're the rich family of Turkey, the Rockefellers. And they donated some of the artifacts, which is just next to the Damascus room. And then, so here we can see on the map, like starting from room 461 to all the way to the Central Park, you actually follow a route from Syria to Turkey, Turkey to Greece, and Greece to the West. And of course, in between, there is the Aegean Sea, there's waters where a lot of refugees are drowning. And there are the Europeans up on the right. And some apricots are making it to the Greek side, to the ancient Greek, but of course they don't really blend well with the rest of the Europeans. And but some of them lucky, and they make it to the West. So while I was constructing this narrative, I wanted to use different layers of code, and apparently there is architectural code which Metropolitan Museum relies on to publish their collections, to display their collections. But also I was looking at the Islamic art that came from Syria, and it's in a very... So the negative space in Islam is the generative space. So it is kind of the opposite of the Zen. So only through repetition you can create, you can reach to negative space or infinity. And this is what we learned in processing. So the processing is a generative tool, and which we can create. So I decided to kind of mock up these Islamic patterns in a sloppy way through JavaScript. And I guess this was also inspired from an assignment that Room used to give while we were teaching together. So printing the code together with the generative image. And here too, so there are some missing parts, of course, of these tiles, like dating back 100 years ago. And some of them are restored with a pen and pencil. And so I was thinking, oh, maybe it could be restored today with the JavaScript. And then thinking about the poetry of things, the poetry side of things, at the same time, because I was looking at Edward Said, where he talks about when you're in exile, we cannot capitalize on goods and capital. So everything starts from a void. This is like a line from Edward Said. And yes, that's what happens in processing. Everything starts with a void setup, and then you start drawing. So that's what it means to be an immigrant. Everything starts with a void, and you have to have a new setup, and then you can start drawing slowly with a word draw. So poetically, it really made sense to include the code which generates the image next to it. And finally, the last episode of the code series is the genetic code of the apricot. So at Rutgers, there's a genetical research center, and I took a dried apricot from Whole Foods, and I brought them, and I asked if they could make a DNA analysis of the apricot. They said yes, but it will take a while, and it's going to be too much too many of lines. Then we together decided to focus on the immune system of the apricot, and they isolated one particular RNA which is responsible for the immune system of the apricot, that it helps to survive in a different environment. So then the amino acid sequence on the right of the screen you see is the RNA sequence which represents the immune system of the apricots. And this is the museologic display of the same story. Like there are basically 4 rooms, the Damascus room and the Turkish room and the ancient Greek alley. And finally, if they're lucky, they make it to the Central Park, the Fifth Avenue entrance of the Metropolitan Museum. Oops. Sorry, maybe I can just go back to this. So this was like a little insert. So, but I wanted to talk really more about the pedagogy of design, but then it sort of relates to some of the projects that I'm doing, because it's inevitable when you're teaching and when you're working in the same media. So of course there's a lot of interaction between students and what I teach and what I do. So I'm aware of some pressing issues that relates to design in digital media, and I'm sure there are burning questions on these emerging topics in contemporary design practice, such as variable fonts, parametric fonts, unsemantic web, responsive design, media queries, DOM, generative adversarial networks, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all sorts of JavaScript libraries and frameworks, P5.js, and Paper.js, processing, data visualization, D3.js, procedural drawing, UI, UX, web design, Google Fonts, Typekit, app design, native iOS, material I/O, skeuomorphism, flat design, I/O prototyping, remote sensing, open frameworks, Unity, Python, live streaming, skill sharing, desktop streaming, CDM, CMS, HTML, CSS, so this list goes on. And while I was preparing this talk, I thought a lot about which of these issues I should be focusing on more. But to be honest, I didn't really have a clear answer to myself, and this brought up a new question on specialization and interdisciplinarity. Apparently, all these are important topics to be covered in the classroom or study environment, yet how can anyone be investing in all these? And this brings up even a larger question. How can one teach as a professional designer in an academic setting, yet maintain an active career in a research discipline? And then a larger question, where does design belong in the academic setting? To communication, to art, to architecture, to technology? So my personal answer and my personal setting is art. I see myself as an artist who designs and a designer who displays works in the artistic context. To go further with this definition, I think a designer is an artist who is more interested in others' problems more than themselves. Design of all the artistic disciplines is the least self-imposed one. But nevertheless, I will try to follow a curricular path in this talk. In spite of my respect and admiration to all non-institutional models of education, I was never adventurous enough to leave the school at any point of my life. Since 7 years old, every fall, in some capacity, I went back to school. So I can only speak about the traditional academic model in design education. Although I'm coming from a science background in college, I've always been interested in ways in which design can be taught and studied. Starting with the first contact with a student, in many cases it is the application process. I would like to go step by step through the higher education, institutional issues, and how digital media and computation shapes our curriculum. So my talk will be more about the academic trope, which is admission, foundation, research, design, and publication. Then business life, maybe real life, and back to admissions for the MFA. I will go through each stage and try to comment on what does computation to the curriculum. So the first is going to be admission. In the meantime, so this is these are work from my classroom, and so it's just a short reel. So I'm not going to really refer to any of these projects. But if you think anything is interesting, we can go back, pause the video, and talk about it. So the first step in higher education, the admission process. It is a commonly known fact that in many schools, the number of applicants are not manageable anymore. In the last decade, the business school of an Ivy League university receives 10,000 applicants with a staff of 10 to review. So basically, every faculty needs to review 1,000 applicants. So they randomly drop out some of the applications, and for the rest, they apply complex formulas to sort the rest out, and in some cases, there are machine reading methods for reading the applications, and I'm sure on the other side of the equation, there's software to generate these letters. So the whole application process can turn into a machine-to-machine conversation, which may not be terrible, actually. And art and design schools, at least for now, seem to be immune to this inflation. However, it is a pressing issue and needs to be addressed by the institutions by providing visibility to the visual landscape of the environment and emphasizing cultural commons of the community and setting clear policies to increase cultural, racial, ethnic, gender, and international diversity. So a while back then I was teaching in Istanbul with an amazing student applied, and he earned his life as an apprentice at an internet cafe nowhere in Anatolia. It's like somewhere in the middle of Anatolia, and totally self-taught himself, inspired from Ryoji Ikeda's work. So back then he was very popular. So I don't know how Ikeda managed to reach out to this young designer, but I know my institution reached out through constant digital publication of the student work and being active in defining the visual and cultural commons of the institution. So after admission, the next is foundation. So with the foundation, the questions arise. Do you code? What do you code? Why do you code? How do you code? Who should code and why they should? Starting from the foundation, I don't see coding or computation as a separate topic to be covered at some point in the curriculum. I would argue that there are pedagogical benefits of teaching basic design studio courses by employing algorithmic graphic programming techniques. It proposes a new pedagogical approach for Bauhaus model basic design education. So procedural aesthetics in the last decade became more popular, And you see, I mean, not this part, but some of the parts, you will see some of the basic design assignments that we carry out through processing at Rutgers of open source communities such as processing and data-driven society. At this point, I would like to emphasize the formal and practical affinities in Bauhaus style, basic design education, and procedure-driven aesthetics. I think there's a potential here at the computerization of design education, and I propose that due to their structural character in algorithmic ways of digital graphic production, are pedagogically more beneficial than the commonly used commercial software, which provides graphical user interfaces for the foundation year. So, as put by Rudolf Arnheim, the unification of comprehension and perception leads to visual thinking. Teaching through the visual thinking involves practice and poetic expression of principles. Yes, I mean, here I mean by poetic expression, I mean the code, such as unity, harmony, balance, hierarchy, scale, proportion, similarity, contrast, repetition, and most importantly, iteration. So recently, increasing literalness in graphic coding languages bridge the gap between the code and the visible. Algorithmic procedures in graphic coding renders the application of principles such as repetition, order, hierarchy much more structured and easier. So starting after the foundation, the sophomore and the junior year, I would name them as like the research years. And data is the most abstract form of information. Various different ways of representation of data can create different meanings. Here, I'd like to quote Aaron Koblin, where he says, 19th century was defined by the novel, 20th century by the cinema, and the culture of the 21st century will be defined by the interface. So designers create meaning by the display of the information by unlocking the rigid categories in which it resides in. For instance, in sophomore level design classes, we work on visualization of data sets, and each student can tell a different story by visualizing the same data. So meaning is not something that is innate to the information, but the way that the information is presented. This may in a way sound conflicting with the scientific methodology. In fact, it is not, because design practice is not experimental process itself, but the representation of the outcomes. However, design itself can also be experimental and functional. And especially in the age of digital data and representation, products take the form of interfaces and help solve some physical problems. At this point, we can quote from Buckminster Fuller, the first nerd, I call him, to go back to a more conventional description of design practice, where he says, when I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty. I think only how to solve the problem, but when I have finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it is wrong. So the next stage, maybe this will be the junior and the senior year, is design. So there are long-term problems in integrating professional workflows in the curriculum. Integrating popular commercial workflows in the curriculum will help the students to find their first jobs, but it becomes harder for them to find their second or third jobs, as they don't learn how to teach themselves and keep up to date with the recent technologies. Design should be research-driven, whether scientific, social, or literary, and inspired by the content. There is no form without content, and there is no content without form. We cannot simulate real-life business workflows in the classroom or studio. We cannot teach what we don't do in day-to-day. And publication is the last stage, probably, before graduating from a design school. So as discussed in depth in the beginning of the symposium, one publishes to find comrades, and one comes to school for time, space, and community. So design needs to go public and evolve over time. Design cannot be evaluated even in the academia before it gets published. As Louis Kahn believed in his brick whispering hymn, the right form, I believe the content and context implies a way for the design to go public. And probably after this, we could talk about applying to a grad school. So does a designer really need a MFA degree? And to what extent a designer needs a degree in MFA design, an MFA degree in design? And I think the question is back again at the same answer. is one comes to school for time, space, and community. And whenever someone feels like lacking of any of these things, time, space, and community, I think it's the time for a designer to go back to school and get an MFA in design. I mean, there are some. I brought up like some questions, but probably we'll have a Q&A and we can address them. Thank you.